It was the fall of 2009. I was 31 then, working as a delivery contractor for a small lumber company in southern Ohio. We serviced remote cabins, mostly vacation homes, but a few were permanent residences for off-grid folks. I wasn't new to the job. I'd been driving box trucks loaded with plywood, planks, and even generators for 6 years. The routes were long, and the hours could get weird, especially if a storm rolled in. But that Friday run was different, off in ways I couldn't fully put into words. That day, I had one last delivery scheduled for a cabin near a small place called Knife Hollow. Just hearing that name used to make me uneasy. The road leading into it was narrow, twisting, and always damp. Moss crept across the asphalt, and deep ruts scarred the edges from years of runoff. It wasn't on GPS. I had a paper map in my glove box marked up with red ink, thanks to my old supervisor, Frank. Avoid Knife Hollow, he'd written in block letters near the bottom. No radio, no turnaround. But the customer that day, an older man named Reuben Langley, had called the main office himself and requested a large drop of cedar planks. He offered extra cash if I could deliver before dark. I was already behind after a late start, and every route except through Knife Hollow would add hours. I figured I'd chance it. I'd never actually been in the hollow, just skirted past it. The truck was half full, roads were clear, and the weather looked decent. Besides, I'd been in tighter spots before. What could really go wrong? I turned off Highway 23 just past 3 in the afternoon. The sun was starting its slow descent, smearing gold across the low hills. The forest here was thicker than elsewhere, scraggly pines and bare sycamores arching over the road like brittle ribs. It smelled like wet leaves and iron. I passed a rusted road sign with bullet holes spelling out Knife Hollow Road and started the descent. The change in atmosphere was immediate. Shadows swallowed the truck even though daylight still hung in the sky. The trees grew closer, leaning in with trunks bent unnaturally, like they were watching the road. The pavement turned to gravel, then dirt, then rutted mud. I slowed to 15 miles an hour. The wheels groaned in protest, rocking with every deep pothole. I kept glancing at the fuel gauge and the side mirrors. No signal on my phone. No sign of any houses. After 30 minutes of grinding forward, I saw the cabin. It was more a shack than a home. Dark wood, no paint, and a sagging porch with cracked beams. Reuben's name was carved crudely into the mailbox. No other structures nearby. Just a clearing that looked like it had been cut from the woods with a hatchet. I didn't see Reuben. I got out and walked around to the back of the truck to unlock the cargo hold. Everything was quiet. No birds, no wind, not even the distant buzz of insects. Just my own boots crunching on gravel. I tried knocking on the door. Nothing. It wasn't locked, but I wasn't about to just walk in. I figured I'd offload the delivery near the front and get the hell out. I had the planks halfway unloaded when I noticed something off. There were footprints, not mine, and not fresh either. They were older, caked into the mud like impressions from heavy boots. But what stood out was the direction. They came from the woods, stopped at the edge of the clearing, and then just turned around. No path, no driveway, just deep steps leading in and back out. I counted them, 13 in, 13 out. They were uneven, one stride longer than the other. I loaded faster. While stacking the last bundle, I caught a flash of something in the tree line. Not movement, not a shape, just something reflective, metal catching light maybe. Could have been anything. I didn't wait to study it. I jumped back in the truck and turned the key. Nothing. No click. No rumble. Just silence. I tried again. Nothing. I checked the battery terminals. Secure. Tried the lights. Dead. Not a flicker. It didn't make sense. The truck had been serviced the week before. No issues, but something had drained it. I checked my phone again. Still no signal. My chest tightened. I grabbed the emergency radio behind the seat. Crackling static, but no voice. Then a short burst, just 3 seconds of audio so garbled I couldn't make it out, like a tape being chewed in a VCR. Then silence again. I decided to walk. I had no choice. I couldn't sit in the truck and wait for night to fall. I had a flashlight and an old thermos of lukewarm coffee. I figured if I stuck to the road and kept moving fast, I could be back on the main highway in under 2 hours. I walked fast. The forest closed in even tighter in reverse. Roots snaked across the path. The air grew colder, and the smell of iron got sharper. The road itself didn't look the same going back. There were places I didn't remember passing. Sharp dips, small clearings, even a rotten signpost I swear wasn't there before. And then I saw the second cabin. It was 20 feet off the road, barely visible behind a curtain of branches. It looked abandoned, roof sagging, door missing, windows shattered. The wood was black, not from paint but from rot. But what caught my eye was a silver Ford Ranger parked beside it, mostly covered in pine needles. The tires were flat, the windows smeared, but the license plate was clear, OH2135S. That plate had been in our yard when I was a kid. It belonged to my Uncle Ray. He vanished in 1998 on a hunting trip. I froze. I stepped off the path, just enough to see through the cabin window. There were tools inside. Rusted saws, axes, bones I didn't want to examine too closely. A dirty mattress on the floor with rope tied to the posts. Blood stains on the walls, some old, some not. That's when I heard the sound. It wasn't an animal, not a person. It was rhythmic, scraping, almost like metal dragging slowly across stone. It came from deep behind the shack, somewhere in the trees. I didn't stick around. I sprinted back onto the path and didn't stop. I don't know how long I ran, but my legs burned and my lungs ached. At some point, I dropped the thermos. I didn't care. I just ran until the road curved hard left, and I saw a small sign ahead, half buried in leaves. Welcome to Preston County. I was out of Knife Hollow. A passing pickup finally saw me. I flagged them down and lied. Said I'd hit a deer and had to abandon the truck. I was too shaken to explain more. When I went back with a tow crew the next morning, the truck was gone. Not moved, not vandalized, gone. Tire tracks ended 10 feet before the cabin's clearing. The trees were undisturbed. No signs of a struggle. No cabin either. Just empty woods. Even the mailbox with Ruben's name was gone. I reported it to the county. They sent 2 officers. They filed it under equipment theft and suspicious disappearance, and I never heard another word about it. I quit that job 3 months later. Now it's 2025, and I haven't gone back to Knife Hollow. I don't even drive through that part of the state anymore. But sometimes, when I'm alone, when I close my eyes, I hear that dragging metal sound again. And I wonder how many cabins were ever really out there. How many trucks and people have gone in but didn't come out. And who or what built that second shack. I try not to think about it too long. I just know it was real. All of it. And if you ever see a shortcut on a map that runs through Knife Hollow, don't take it. Take the long way, every time. It was a cold, quiet afternoon when I found myself driving down a narrow, winding road deep in the woods. The weather had been shifting all day, and as the sun began to set, the chill of evening seeped into the air, heavy with moisture. I could feel the dampness in my bones, a typical autumn night in the mountains. My headlights sliced through the thickening fog, casting long shadows on the trees that lined the road. I had been to this part of the woods countless times in my youth, but this was different. The familiar comfort of the area now felt unsettling. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because I was alone. Maybe because this time, I was on my way to a place I hadn't visited in years. My stepsister's cabin. Her name was Emma, and she had recently moved into the cabin after inheriting it from an aunt. A week before, I had gotten an unexpected message from her, asking if I could swing by to help with some repairs. The request had seemed strange at the time, but I agreed. I hadn't seen Emma in a while, and she'd always been more of a distant family member to me, so it was easy to put off visiting her. But now, as I drove closer to the cabin, an odd feeling began to creep over me. The last time I'd been out here, Emma was just a kid. I couldn't picture her in this cabin. It didn't seem like a place she'd choose for herself, but here she was. I turned the corner, and there it was. The cabin stood at the edge of a clearing, a lonely silhouette in the darkening woods. Its wooden structure was weathered, with patches of moss growing on the roof, and the windows were dark, void of life. I parked the car in front, the gravel crunching under the tires. I sat there for a moment, staring at the cabin, my hands still gripping the steering wheel. Something about it felt off. The air was too still. It was like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I forced myself to shake off the unease. I had a job to do. Emma was counting on me. I grabbed my bag, checked to make sure I had all the tools she'd asked for, and stepped out of the car. The sound of my boots crunching on the gravel echoed through the emptiness. As I walked toward the cabin, I noticed how quiet it was. No animals, no rustling leaves. The silence was almost oppressive. I knocked on the door, my knuckles tapping lightly against the wood. A long, awkward moment passed before I knocked again, harder this time. The door creaked open just enough for Emma to peek out. Her face was pale, her eyes tired, and she looked different. There was something about her demeanor that felt off, like she hadn't had a decent night's sleep in a long time. I chalked it up to the stress of moving into a new place. "Hey," she greeted me, a forced smile tugging at her lips. "Thanks for coming. Of course, you said you needed some help with repairs." "Yeah, come on in," she replied, stepping aside to let me in. I stepped into the cabin, and the temperature inside was noticeably colder than outside. The air had that musty smell of wood that hadn't been aired out in a long time. The faint smell of mildew lingered, but it wasn't overpowering. The inside of the cabin was just as unwelcoming as the outside. Everything seemed old, worn down, nothing like I remembered from my visits when we were kids. There was a low-hanging beam above, and the furniture looked mismatched, as if she hadn't bothered to decorate yet. "I've got some issues with the plumbing and the roof," she said, leading me toward the small living area. "But it's mostly just small stuff that's been bothering me. Nothing major." I nodded, trying to make sense of her nervous energy. There was something else, something that I couldn't put my finger on. "So, what's been going on?" I asked, not wanting to pry but needing to understand the situation. She looked like she hadn't been sleeping well, and the fact that she was asking for help felt unusual for her. Emma had always been independent. She hesitated before answering. "Nothing, really. It's just this place. I don't know. It's been a bit strange." "Strange how?" I asked, genuinely curious now. She shook her head, her eyes flickering toward the window. "It's nothing. I'm probably just being paranoid." Her tone was sharp, and I could sense she didn't want to talk about it. So, I dropped the subject and followed her outside to start on the repairs. We worked in silence for a while. The cabin had been neglected for years, and it didn't take long for me to realize that Emma had been right. It was more than just small issues. There were structural problems, water damage, and even signs that the place hadn't been properly maintained in a long time. But we weren't getting anywhere fast. The roof was going to take a few hours to repair, and that was just the beginning. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I'd occasionally glance over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, but there was never anyone there. It was always just the trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind. But every now and then, I'd hear something in the distance, a twig snapping or the faint rustle of leaves. "Are you sure no one else is around?" I asked Emma, trying to keep my voice casual. "Yeah, I'm sure," she replied quickly, though I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "I haven't seen anyone for days." That was the first thing that struck me as odd. The woods around the cabin were remote, sure, but it wasn't as if no one ever came around. There were usually hikers, hunters, or even the occasional delivery. Yet here, there was nothing. It was as though the world outside had simply forgotten about this place. The sky had grown darker by the time we finished the roof repairs. The sun was nearly gone, and the cold was setting in. Emma suggested I stay the night, but I was hesitant. There was something off about the whole situation. The stillness in the air, the way the trees seemed to close in around the cabin. It felt like we were trapped, surrounded by something I couldn't quite define. "I'm just going to head back to town," I told her, packing up my tools. I'll come back tomorrow to finish up. All right? Emma didn't try to stop me. She just nodded, her eyes filled with something. Fear. Maybe? But she didn't say anything else, and I left. As I made my way down the gravel road, the unease I had been feeling only intensified. The further I got from the cabin, the more I wanted to look back. My gut told me something wasn't right. Couldn't explain it, but it gnawed at me. I glanced in my rearview mirror. The cabin stood there, a shadow in the night, almost like it was watching me leave. I drove faster, eager to escape whatever strange feeling had settled over me. But as I turned a corner, I saw something or someone standing by the side of the road. I slammed on the brakes, heart racing. It was a person, tall and thin, standing motionless in the middle of nowhere. I was too far away to make out any details, but I could feel the weight of their stare, even through the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought about stopping, but then I remembered the feeling I had gotten back at the cabin, the feeling that we weren't alone. I floored the gas pedal, the engine roaring as I sped away. When I reached the nearest town, I didn't slow down. I drove straight to the police station and told them what had happened. The officer who listened to my story didn't look too concerned. "It's probably just some drifter," he said. "People wander through these woods all the time. You're safe now." But I wasn't convinced. There was something about that figure in the road that didn't sit right with me. The way it had been standing perfectly still, and the feeling that had come over me when I passed Emma's cabin, that I wasn't the only one there. I didn't return to the cabin the next day. In fact, I didn't return at all. I told Emma I was too busy to finish the repairs, and she never pushed me to come back. But something in the back of my mind still nags at me. I never learned who that figure was on the side of the road. I never went back to the cabin to find out what Emma was really dealing with. But I do know this. I'm not the only one who's been out there. And sometimes, late at night, I can still feel the weight of those eyes watching me. I was 39 when I decided to take a break from everything. My name is Daniel Rhodes. I was living in Southern Oregon at the time, working long days in construction and barely making it through the weeks without feeling worn down to the bone. I just finished a 9-month project in the city, one of those jobs where every minute felt like a weight pressing on your ribs. I needed quiet. I needed somewhere far from the grind, far from concrete, deadlines, and the buzz of other people's lives. A buddy of mine, Eric, had this cabin up near Crater Lake. His uncle had built it back in the 70s, just a single-story wooden box surrounded by trees and silence. He let me borrow it for a few days in March, said it was basic, with stove, propane cooktop, no Wi-Fi, patchy phone reception. But he promised it was quiet, dry, and just what I needed. I packed up a cooler, brought a couple of books, and drove up on a Wednesday morning with a full tank and no real plan. The weather was already turning when I got there. Rain had started to drift in, thin at first, just whispering against the windshield. But by the time I parked the truck and got the front door unlocked, it was coming down harder. The gravel path leading up to the place was soft and already pooling in spots, and I had to slog through it to get my gear inside. The cabin itself was just like Eric said. Simple, nothing fancy, but solid. A good roof, a pile of dry wood stacked neatly by the stove, a cast iron skillet hanging from a nail, just enough to live without thinking. By Thursday morning, the rain hadn't stopped. It had actually gotten worse. I woke to the sound of it hammering the metal roof like it was trying to punch holes through. The trees groaned and swayed outside the little windows, and the yard, which had been firm when I arrived, was now a soggy, uneven mess. I made coffee on the propane burner, threw on a thick sweater, and sat by the small fire I'd started with kindling from the stack. There was peace in it, real peace, the kind of silence that rings in your ears when you've lived too long in cities. No cars, no phones, just weather and wood. I read for a while, made a sandwich, and dozed off on the couch wrapped in a wool blanket. The sound that woke me that afternoon was soft. Not a bang, not a knock, more like a dull thunk, like something heavy falling a few yards away. It didn't seem urgent, but it got my attention. I stood up, stretched, and walked to the front window. Rain was still coming down in curtains. Visibility was low. Everything looked dark, soggy, and cold. I couldn't see anything out of place. I figured maybe a tree limb had come down somewhere. It made sense with the way the wind was pushing through the forest. Still, something about it didn't sit right. I slipped on my boots, zipped up my jacket, and stepped out onto the porch. Right away, the cold got to me. The air was raw, and even under the porch roof, water blew in sideways. I took the flashlight from the shelf by the door and stepped off the porch into the mud. The sound had come from the back, somewhere past the tree-line. I walked slowly, boots sinking into the wet earth with every step. I didn't want to wander far, visibility was poor, and I had no business getting lost over a hunch, but I made it maybe 30 or 40 feet before I saw it. Patch of ground, maybe 10 feet across, looked wrong. It had sunk slightly, like the earth had caved in under its own weight. Mud had pooled around the edges, and in the middle of it, there was this hole. Not deep, maybe 4 or 5 feet across, but definitely not natural. I crouched down near the edge of it. The rain made it hard to see clearly, but the way the soil had fallen away looked recent, fresh. There were no plants growing out of it. The roots that had been torn looked clean and bright. I leaned a little closer and tried to shine my light into the pit. There wasn't much to see, just wet, soft mud, and a sort of rotted log near the bottom. Still, it didn't look like any kind of hole I'd expect to find naturally in a forest. It was too even, too round. I turned back toward the cabin. Rain was soaking through the cuffs of my sleeves. I figured I'd dry off, come back in the morning when it wasn't pouring, and take a better look. That was my plan. But that night changed it. I barely slept. The wind picked up, and the stove didn't hold heat long enough to keep the place comfortable. I was cold, damp, and kept waking up to small sounds outside. They weren't close, just little, distant movements. Could have been animals, could have been branches falling, but they kept happening. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. That same thunk, exactly the same, like something heavy hitting the ground. I got up and walked to the window. Nothing, just the dark shape of trees swaying in the rain. Still, something kept me standing there, staring into it, longer than I should have. I saw movement then, not fast, not clear, but something near the tree-line. A shape, person. It was too dark to be sure, but it was tall, and it was standing too still to be a deer or anything like that. It didn't move for a long time. Then it did. It walked slowly, along the edge of the trees, toward where the hole had been. I didn't go back to sleep after that. I sat in the armchair with a blanket around me, the fire barely smoldering, just listening. I didn't hear anything else until the rain started to ease up around dawn. When the light started to bleed through the clouds, I got up and pulled on my boots. The ground outside was worse than the day before. Sticky, slick, but I pushed through it toward the hole. It was deeper now, at least 2 feet deeper than it had been. The sides had collapsed in more, and that rotted log at the bottom wasn't there anymore. What was there was a drag mark, faint but real, like something had been pulled out. There were prints around the edge. Not boots, not shoes, just bare feet. Long, thin ones, too big to be a child's and way too cold out for anyone to be out barefoot. I felt sick. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, trying to come up with a good explanation, any explanation, and couldn't. I walked back inside and locked the door. The power went out later that day. The propane still worked so I could cook, but everything else went dark. I didn't mind the dark. I minded the silence, because I kept hearing things again. That night, the sounds were closer. No more distant thunks, just footsteps, soft, wet ones, circling the cabin. I sat up all night again, didn't move from the chair. At one point, I thought I saw someone right outside the window, but I didn't dare check. I just sat, holding the flashlight in one hand and a knife I found in the kitchen drawer in the other. The next morning, I packed up to leave. When I stepped out onto the porch, I saw that someone had been on it during the night. Bare footprints, muddy, long toes, wide arches. One print had smeared down the wooden step like someone had slipped. I didn't even stop to eat. I grabbed my keys, threw everything into the truck, and backed out fast down the muddy track. The tires slipped and skidded, but I didn't care. I just needed distance. When I got back to town, I didn't tell anyone. Not Eric. Not the gas station clerk who asked if the rain had wrecked my trip. I just said it was quiet, that it was what I needed. I didn't sleep well for weeks. I had nightmares where the hole got bigger and bigger until it swallowed the entire forest. Other nights I'd dream I was back inside the cabin, and I'd hear those slow, steady footsteps on the roof, on the porch, around the walls. Eventually, I started sleeping again. I buried the memory in the back of my mind and told myself it was just exhaustion. Just rain and shadows and tired nerves playing tricks. But a few weeks ago, more than a year since I stayed there, Eric called. He said the cabin had been broken into, that nothing was taken, but the front door was hanging open and the inside was soaked. He laughed about it, said maybe some idiot had gone looking for shelter during a storm, said there were weird footprints on the porch when he got there. I told him I had no idea what that could be, and I meant it, because I didn't want to know. I was 35 when I decided to leave the city for a while. It was early November 2019, right before the snow started to hit hard in the northern parts of Minnesota. I'd been working a maintenance job at a packaging plant just outside of Minneapolis. Long shifts, loud machines, and fluorescent lights had burned me out. I needed some time away. No phones, no people, no noise. I remembered an old cabin my uncle had owned deep in the woods near the Canadian border. He'd passed a few years back, and the cabin had just been sitting there. No one had wanted to sell it. Everyone forgot about it except me. The place was small, just a single-story rectangle with a front porch and a wood stove inside. My uncle had built it by hand in the early 80s. I'd been there a few times as a kid, fishing and chopping firewood with him, but not once in the past 15 years. The roof needed repairs, and the inside was musty with old paperbacks and rusted tools. But it stood strong, wrapped in thick trees and silence. I took 2 weeks off work, packed up my truck with tools, canned food, propane, and a sleeping bag, and drove up north. It was nearly a 7-hour drive, with most of the last hour crawling over dirt roads that hadn't seen traffic in ages. I got there around noon on a Wednesday, just as the gray clouds started to stretch over the sky like a wool blanket. I parked next to the stump near the porch, unloaded my stuff, and got the stove going right away. There was no power, no plumbing, and barely any signal, but that's what I wanted. Just the sound of wind, the smell of pine, and the crackle of firewood. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my mornings clearing leaves off the roof, replacing cracked panes in the windows, and resealing the gaps in the wall where cold air leaked in. In the afternoons, I'd go down to the creek a mile away, just walking and breathing. It was the 6th night when something felt different. That afternoon had been colder than usual, and I spent a bit longer than I planned splitting firewood behind the cabin. I noticed a few tracks out in the mud, boot prints, not mine. At first I thought maybe I'd made them earlier in the week and forgot. They weren't deep, and they were going the opposite direction from the creek. I ignored it, didn't want to start imagining things. But that night, just before I turned in, I thought I saw something at the edge of the woods. I stood on the porch with a mug of tea, my breath fogging up in the cold air. The tree line was about 30 feet out, just dark shapes in the moonlight, still and shadowy. But one of those shapes looked different.
Taller.
Like a person standing between the trunks. I blinked and looked again, and it was gone. I chalked it up to the wind and my tired eyes. I went inside, dropped the latch on the door, and let the stove burn low. I laid in my sleeping bag on the old cot near the window and tried to sleep. That was the first night I didn't. I kept hearing small sounds. Thumps, scraping. Once or twice I thought I heard something brushing along the side of the cabin. But when I looked out the window, there was nothing. Maybe it was a branch or an animal. That's what I told myself. It was still hard to sleep. The next day I was on edge. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt watched. I checked the woods all around the cabin, walked out past the tree line, even circled around the property, but there was no one, just trees. I told myself maybe a hunter had passed by, Maybe the prints were from last week. Maybe the shadows were just shadows. I should have left that day. Instead, I stayed. I told myself I wasn't going to run from nothing, but I wasn't thinking straight. That night, I made sure the firewood pile was stacked inside the door, locked everything tight, and pulled a chair over to the window. I sat there with a flashlight and an old crowbar my uncle had left behind. I didn't sleep. At some point in the night, I heard the sound again. A footstep, not an animal, heavy, deliberate, right outside the window on the side of the cabin. I didn't move. My breath caught in my throat. It was a long pause, then another footstep closer this time. Then a soft scrape against the wall near the window. I waited for something to show up in the moonlight, but nothing did. Then it stopped, just like that. No retreating steps, no movement, just silence. I waited almost an hour before I dared get up. I didn't open the door. I didn't go outside. I just sat there until the sun came up. I thought maybe I was going crazy. Maybe the woods were messing with my head. I forced myself to sleep a few hours in the daylight. When I woke, I went outside and saw more footprints. Clearer this time. Not mine. Bigger. Deep in the wet dirt, circling the cabin. Someone had walked around it in the middle of the night. More than once. That was when I started preparing to leave. I packed some things in the truck, but I still didn't drive off. Part of me didn't want to give up. I still don't know why I stayed. Stubbornness, maybe pride. That night, the last night, I sat up again. This time I had a hatchet beside me. I didn't drink anything, didn't light the fire, didn't move from the chair. The woods were dead silent. Then, at around 3 in the morning, I heard the sound of a branch breaking. Loud, close, then another. It wasn't random. It was coming straight toward the cabin. Step by step. Heavy boots on dry branches. No flashlight, no lantern, no sound but footsteps. I gripped the hatchet and stayed still. Then I heard the front steps creak. They were old wood, warped from years of snow and rot, and they groaned loud when someone stepped on them. I didn't breathe. The door rattled, just a little, like someone testing it. Then silence again. A long time passed. Then I heard something behind the cabin. It didn't make sense. There had only been footsteps at the front. No snow, no gravel, no other way around without making noise. But something was now at the back wall, the window near the stove. I heard breathing, not mine, a slow, low breath right up against the glass. I didn't move. Then it stopped. I waited until dawn. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. When the sun came up, I got outside and circled the cabin. More prints, some going to the porch, others around the side, but none at the back where I heard the breathing. No broken twigs, no marks, just untouched leaves. I didn't pack the rest of my things. I left with what I had, drove off down that dirt road, didn't look back. I slept in my truck at a rest stop 5 hours south. I stayed at a cheap motel that night and got home the next day. I never went back to the cabin. A week later, I filed a report with the county sheriff up there. They didn't take it seriously, said there were old squatters or hunters sometimes, but no complaints in that area. No signs of forced entry. They didn't follow up. I didn't expect them to. I sold the cabin a year later. The buyer was a man from Wisconsin who wanted a hunting spot. I didn't tell him what happened. I just took the check, signed the papers, and let it go. To this day, I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. I've replayed that night in my head 100 times. The steps, the breathing, the silence. I remember the feeling of being hunted, of something watching me from the dark, of someone knowing I was alone. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was real, flesh and blood. That's what makes it worse. It was the fall of 2013 when I agreed to watch over my uncle's cabin while he recovered from a leg injury. He was in his late 60s, still sharp, but his doctor had told him no walking on uneven ground for at least 6 weeks. He didn't want the place sitting empty. I was 31 at the time, between jobs, and had nothing really keeping me in town. He offered me $1,000 and a stocked pantry. I said yes. The cabin was in a remote patch of land in northern Minnesota, about an hour past Duluth, tucked several miles off the main road. He used it mostly for hunting, sometimes just to get away. The land stretched out in every direction, nothing but forest and brush. Nearest neighbor was 5 miles, maybe more. He gave me the keys, showed me how to run the propane heater, warned me to keep the generator fuel dry, and left me a handwritten list of instructions. Things like, check the roof for branches, keep the woodpile covered, and don't forget the bear-proof latches on the bins. I got there on a Thursday morning, October 10th, still early enough in the season that the roads were clear. Trees were yellow and red, and the air was crisp but not biting. I brought a duffel bag with enough clothes for 2 weeks, plus my boots, a couple of books, and a .22 rifle my dad had given me years ago. My uncle had his own hunting rifles locked in a steel cabinet inside, but I didn't plan to hunt. I just wanted some peace and quiet. The first few days were perfect. I spent the mornings chopping kindling, keeping the fire going, walking the trails. I'd heat up Ken's soup, read on the porch, and listen to the wind rustling through the trees. No phone service, no internet. I had an old iPod and a deck of cards. I didn't mind the isolation. In fact, it felt like a break from everything. There was no running water, but my uncle had 2 large water barrels outside. I'd bring in buckets and heat them up on the stove for washing dishes or rinsing off. The outhouse was about 50 yards out through a narrow path. I didn't mind it during the day, but I avoided going out there at night. There was a 5-gallon bucket with a lid inside the cabin. It worked fine for emergencies. I kept a notebook and wrote down everything I did. Not because I needed to, but because I thought it might be nice to give my uncle a record. Plus, it gave my days a bit of structure. Wake up, stoke fire, haul water, prep wood, sweep porch, clean stove. On the 5th night, I noticed something strange. I'd gone to bed around 10, after reading by lantern for a while. I had the fire down low to save wood, and the wind had picked up, so I figured the occasional bump and thud outside was just branches or pine cones falling on the roof. But around 2 in the morning, I heard something else. A crunch. Not the sharp snap of a branch under a squirrel. A heavier step. Then another. I froze in bed, lying perfectly still under the thick wool blanket. The cabin was dead quiet. I held my breath. Another crunch, slower this time. It sounded like someone stepping on gravel or dry leaves. I listened for a minute, then 2. Nothing. The wind blew again. I heard a soft creak from the porch. I got up slowly and grabbed the rifle. I didn't turn on the light. I moved to the small window near the door and looked out, careful not to move the curtain too much. It was pitch black. No moon, thick clouds. I couldn't see anything. I waited there another 5 minutes, my eyes adjusting. Still nothing. I chalked it up to maybe a raccoon or something bumping the porch. I didn't open the door. I went back to bed, rifle leaning next to me. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I stepped out and checked the ground. The dirt and pine needles on the trail didn't show any clear footprints, but near the steps of the porch, I saw something odd. A spot where the needles looked brushed aside, like something heavy had stood there and shifted its weight. Could have been a bear. Could have been nothing. I didn't like it. That day, I kept the rifle with me while I did chores. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, maybe 300 feet in all directions from the cabin. I didn't see anything out of place. I figured I'd just gotten spooked. But the next night, it happened again. Same time, just after 2 in the morning, I woke up and immediately felt that something wasn't right. I didn't hear footsteps this time, just stillness, too still, like the air had changed. My gut said someone was out there. I waited, not moving. Eventually, I did hear something. Faint knock. One soft bump, like something tapped the side of the cabin. Then nothing. 10 minutes later, another. This time I got up, put on my coat, and quietly stepped over to the door. I didn't open it. I stood there, rifle in one hand, listening. My heart was thudding. The kind of fear that builds slowly, that doesn't come from panic but from a creeping certainty. I knew someone was out there. I stayed like that for nearly an hour before I heard footsteps fading into the woods. Then silence. In the morning, I found what looked like boot prints near the back wall of the cabin. Just one, maybe two. The ground was dry, so there wasn't much definition, but it wasn't mine. I wore heavier tread, and I hadn't walked behind the cabin at all the day before. That day, I made a decision. I wasn't going to panic, but I was going to take it seriously. I dragged a chair against the door at night, even though it had a deadbolt. I rechecked all the latches on the windows. I kept the rifle loaded and on the table next to the bed. I stayed inside after sundown. The third night, I didn't sleep at all. The sounds came again, this time earlier, around 1. First, the soft tapping, then something moving by the window. I kept the lights off and didn't make a sound. I had the rifle ready and sat on the edge of the bed, just listening. This time I heard breathing. Not close, but definitely human. Slow, heavy exhales. It lasted maybe a minute, then retreating steps. I waited until morning before going out. This time there were clearer prints near the outhouse. Smaller boots, maybe a size 9 or 10. Not mine, definitely not an animal. I walked the trail past the outhouse, deeper into the woods, looking for anything. Maybe some local hiker had gotten lost, but that didn't make sense. Who wanders this far out, past locked gates, through posted land, 3 nights in a row? I found something about 30 yards in. A torn piece of flannel caught on a branch. It was old-looking, faded red, like part of a shirt. No blood, no sign of struggle. Just hanging there like someone brushed against the limb and didn't notice. I took it back inside and kept it on the table. Not sure why. By the end of the week, I stopped sleeping entirely. I would nap in short bursts during the afternoon, never after dark. I ate less. I kept the lanterns full and the fire burning low, just enough to stay warm. On the 8th night, it escalated. Around midnight, I heard something slam against the side of the cabin. Hard, like a shoulder or a body. Then running footsteps. I jumped up, grabbed the rifle, and moved to the window. I saw something move across the clearing. Dark, quick, not an animal. I didn't fire. I didn't even open the window. I just watched as the shape disappeared into the tree line. I stood there the rest of the night. No more sounds. No return. At dawn, I checked the spot. There was a fresh mark on the siding scuffed wood where something hit. I found more prints, 2 circling the back. Same size, same direction. I didn't know if it was one person or more. I started to suspect I was being watched during the day, too. When I'd haul water or split wood, I'd get this pressure at the back of my neck like I wasn't alone. Once I thought I heard a low whistle from the trees. Just one note. I turned and aimed the rifle, but nothing moved. By the 10th day, I was losing it. Sleep-deprived, jumpy, twitching at every sound. I didn't want to call the sheriff unless I had real evidence. I didn't have cell service anyway. The nearest payphone was miles away, and I didn't want to leave the cabin unattended. If someone was out there, they'd know when I left. So I stayed. On the 12th night, I woke up to the sound of the door handle moving. Not once, several times. Someone was trying to open it slowly, quietly, thinking I wouldn't notice. But I had the chair still jammed under it, and the deadbolt was solid. I didn't move. I just sat up in bed and waited. After a full minute, the handle stopped. Then footsteps circled the cabin again. I heard whispering, not words, just the tone of it. 2 people, confirming something. I aimed the rifle at the door and stayed that way for hours. The next morning, I made a choice. I packed everything into my duffel, loaded up the truck, and left. I didn't care about finishing the 2 weeks. I'd lasted long enough. I didn't want money. I didn't want to be a tough guy. I wanted to survive. I drove the 30 miles to the nearest sheriff's office and reported everything. They took me seriously, kind of. They said the area had a history of squatters, people living off-grid. Meth labs, even. One deputy offered to go back out with me. We returned together 2 days later. Back in 2017, I was 32, working construction in a small Alberta town near the Saskatchewan border. The company I worked for mostly did framing jobs, barns, and oil field structures. Winters were always brutal up there. If we didn't land a big job before late October, work dried up and so did paychecks. That year, we finished our last big contract mid-November, and there was nothing lined up after that. I didn't have a wife or kids, just a one-bedroom basement suite I barely spent time in. I wasn't too worried about taking a few months off. A buddy of mine, Colin, offered me his family's hunting cabin while he and his girlfriend spent the winter in British Columbia. They were going to house sit her uncle's place on the coast. He said the cabin was old but sturdy, had wood heat, solar panels for basic electricity, a propane stove, and a big pantry of canned food. Said it'd be perfect if I wanted to save money and get away for a while. I didn't think twice. The cabin was about 70 kilometers from town, tucked deep into a patch of bush and rolling hills. You had to take an old forestry road for half an hour after leaving the highway, and then another 15-minute drive down a rutted trail barely wide enough for a truck. I brought up my tools, some extra food, my rifle, a stack of books, and enough firewood to last the winter. Or at least I thought I did. The first week was peaceful. I settled into a routine, chopped kindling in the morning, checked the snow buildup on the roof, read, hunted snowshoe hares and the odd grouse, and wrote in a little journal column left on the windowsill. The solar battery worked well enough to power a couple lights and charge my phone if I was conservative. There was no signal out there anyway, so the phone just became a glorified flashlight. The silence was the kind you only get way out past the grid. No hum of cars, no planes overhead, no neighbors yelling at their dogs. Just the wind moving through the trees and the occasional crack of branches under snow. That changed after the second week. One morning, I woke up to find tracks around the cabin. Not animal tracks, boots. The snow had fallen steadily overnight, and I hadn't gone outside since the evening before. I walked a wide circle around the cabin and found a single trail of prints coming from the west tree line, looping around behind the outhouse and then back the way it came. No vehicle tracks, no snowmobile marks, just those boots. It rattled me, but I tried to be rational. Maybe a trapper had wandered too far from his line. Maybe he was curious. Maybe he'd come by to see if anyone was there and left when he saw smoke from the chimney. Still, I started carrying my rifle everywhere after that, even to the outhouse. A few days passed, and nothing happened. I figured I'd been jumpy, let my imagination run too far. But then I started noticing small things, the kind of things you wouldn't think twice about unless you were out there alone. I kept a hatchet wedged into a stump near the front steps. One morning, it was gone. I figured maybe I'd used it for kindling the night before and left it inside, but I couldn't find it anywhere in the cabin. 2 days later, it was back, clean, and stuck into the same stump like nothing happened. Then the door handle. It was one of those old brass ones, the kind with the thumb latch. Started sticking like someone had jimmied it or tried to pry it open. I blamed the cold at first, until I found faint scratches on the wood around the latch. Tiny, shallow grooves that didn't look like wear and tear. I tried to brush it off. I kept telling myself there were reasonable explanations. Cold metal warping, wildlife nosing around. Maybe I'd just forgotten things or was sleepwalking, but I didn't believe any of that. The feeling I had inside me every night when I sat by the stove with the rifle on my lap wasn't just nerves. It was something deeper, a kind of pressure, like I was being watched, not by something unknown, but by another person. That was what made it worse. It wasn't spooky or supernatural. It was real, human, and dangerous. Then one night, I found the dead rabbit. I'd set a few snares near the trail that ran east through the trees. I checked them daily. One morning, one of the snares was empty, but the wire was still taut and bloody. That happens sometimes, I figured. Predators will take a rabbit from the snare, leave the wire. But that night, I found the rabbit on the front steps. Clean, intact, but frozen solid. Its fur was matted with dried blood, but it hadn't been eaten, just left there like a gift, or a warning. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the fire low so the chimney wouldn't give away my presence. Sat in the dark with the rifle across my knees and listened. Nothing came, nothing moved, but I didn't sleep. I made a plan the next day. I would stay 2 more nights, just enough to get my gear packed and clear the trail with the shovel. Then I'd leave. The snow had been light, and I figured I could get the truck out with some effort. I wasn't going to try and wait out a whole winter if someone was out there messing with me. That evening, as I was boiling water for tea, I heard a sound that nearly stopped my heart. It was the truck. My truck. The door had opened and slammed shut. I didn't move. I let the kettle hiss and quietly reached for the rifle. The cabin only had one window that looked toward the clearing where the truck was parked, and it was covered in frost. I slowly wiped a corner clear and peered out. The truck's dome light was on. Someone had opened the door and was now sitting in the driver's seat. I turned off the stove, crept to the door, and braced myself against the frame, listening. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I waited 15 minutes. The dome light eventually faded out. No movement. When I finally stepped outside, the cold hit like a slap. I approached the truck with my finger on the trigger. The door was closed again, and there were no tracks. None. No prints in the snow except mine from the cabin. But I know what I saw. I checked the inside. Nothing missing. Keys were still in the glove box, but the seat was warm. I barely slept that night. I kept hearing things. A tap on the wall, a shifting creak on the roof, the crunch of snow that might have just been the stove settling. I couldn't tell anymore what was real. The next day, I packed everything. I didn't care about organizing it. I just shoved what I could into bags, loaded the truck, and started clearing the trail. I worked until my shoulders ached and my gloves froze stiff. By nightfall, I was ready to leave first light, but I didn't make it to morning. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a banging sound. Not a knock, this was full-on pounding. Something was hitting the front door over and over, steady, hard. I grabbed the rifle and stood by the bed, heart thundering. It stopped suddenly. Then I heard it again, from the back wall. Not the door, the wall itself. I backed toward the kitchen. It sounded like someone was moving around the outside of the cabin, pounding here and there, like they were testing the structure. Then it went quiet. For 10 minutes, maybe 20. I stood frozen, gun up, not daring to breathe. Then the window shattered. Glass exploded inward across the floor. I dropped, rolled behind the table, and aimed at the dark square of the broken pane. Nothing came through. Nothing moved. Just the cold wind whistling in, sucking warmth from the room like a vacuum. I stayed there until sunrise. When the sky finally lightened, I moved, got the fire going, grabbed what was left of my gear, and shoved it into the truck. I didn't care about anything else. I drove down that trail, over the frozen ruts and packed snow, barely keeping the truck on the path. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I drove straight to town, parked at a gas station, and sat there shaking for half an hour. I never told Colin the full story. I said a bear got curious, broke a window, and spooked me out. He didn't question it much. When he went back in the spring, he texted me a photo of the cabin. The broken window was boarded up, but everything else looked the same, except the front door. Someone had carved something into it. It was just a single word, etched deep into the wood with something sharp. It said, "Stay." I never went back. I don't know who was out there or why they did what they did, but it wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was a person, and they didn't want me there. That's what stayed with me. Not the fear or the silence, but the fact that whoever it was had been watching. Waiting. They had time. They didn't rush. They didn't scream or show themselves. They just waited for me to feel the right kind of afraid. And they got exactly what they wanted. I still think about that winter every time I hear snow crunch under boots. Every time I see frost on a window. I still don't sleep well when the world goes quiet. Because out there, in that quiet, someone was watching me. And I think they still are. I was 38 when I decided to take a break from everything. The year was 2016, and life back in Derbyshire had gotten too loud for me. I had just gone through a messy breakup, my job in logistics was hanging by a thread, and my dad had passed the previous summer. I wasn't looking for peace as much as I was just trying to feel something different. I had an old friend, Marcus, who lived up in Northumberland, not far from a hill range called Kilmer Ridge. He'd bought a stretch of woodland a few years back, with a small off-grid cabin that barely got a mobile signal. He wasn't there most of the year. He worked in London and only came up in winter. When I called and asked if I could stay at the cabin for a couple of weeks, he said sure, gave me directions, and told me where the spare key was hidden. I packed up my old Ford Mondeo with 2 coolers, a gas stove, a shotgun I'd inherited from my dad, and a few odds and ends that I thought might come in handy. I didn't plan to hunt anything. I just liked the comfort of it being there. Took me nearly 6 hours to drive up. The last half hour was rough, narrow roads that twisted through endless pine. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked like something out of a painting. Small, squat, made of faded timber with a black tin roof and a wraparound porch that looked like it might give out if you leaned on it. It stood alone, surrounded by thick forest that reached in every direction. No neighbors, no lights, no noise. Just wind through trees and the distant tapping of branches against each other. Inside, it was simple. 1 room with a bed, a small table, a wood stove, and a cabinet full of dry goods. No electricity. A water pump stood about 20 feet from the door, and Marcus had left a big blue barrel to collect rainwater. The first night, I got the stove going, heated up some tinned beans, and just sat outside under a flannel blanket, listening. It wasn't peaceful, not exactly. It was empty. That kind of quiet scratches at your brain after a while. Still, I liked it. I slept like a corpse that night. The first few days passed without much to note. I chopped wood, cooked simple meals, walked a few trails Marcus had cut around the area. Every now and then, I'd see deer trails or fox tracks, but nothing bigger. The air was cold but dry, and I stopped thinking about my old life for the first time in months. No calls, no emails, just routine. Mornings were spent splitting kindling or boiling water. Evenings were for whiskey, the book I'd brought, and the creak of trees in the wind. About a week in, I noticed the first strange thing. I had left a small pile of chopped wood just by the pump, enough to last a day or two. I went out that morning and half of it was gone. No sign of disturbance, no prints, just missing. I figured maybe I'd miscounted, or maybe I'd used more than I thought the day before. Didn't think much of it. I chopped more, stacked it again, and forgot about it. Next morning, same thing, half gone. This time, I knew something wasn't right. The ground was too frozen for prints to show, but nothing else looked touched. I walked the area, thinking maybe an animal had dragged it, but there were no drag marks, no broken branches, nothing. It was just gone. Still, I told myself it had to be animals, or maybe the wind knocked some pieces down the hill. I started bringing the wood inside after that. Just didn't want to deal with it. 3 nights later, I woke up just after 2 a.m. Something had thudded against the side of the cabin. It wasn't loud, more like someone kicking the lower boards with the sole of their boot. Just once, then nothing. I sat up in bed, heart thumping in my throat, and listened. Silence. No wind, no movement. I pulled on my boots and coat, grabbed the shotgun from beside the bed, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was dead still. The trees stood like dark skeletons under the pale moon. I walked around the cabin slow, listening hard. No signs of anything, no movement, but the back corner, just beneath the window, had a fresh scuff in the mud. Looked like a boot print, partial but definitely human. My blood went cold. There was no way anyone should be out here. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, just sat with the shotgun in my lap, waiting for the sun to rise. The next morning, I checked the woods around the cabin again. Walked further out, maybe half a mile in all directions. No sign of anyone. No camps, no boot tracks, no litter. Just cold trees and quiet. I started to wonder if I'd imagined it. Cabin fever, maybe. It was easier to believe that than the idea that someone was walking around out there in the middle of the night. But that night, it happened again. This time I didn't hear a thud, but I felt something, like being watched. Crawled up my neck and sat behind my ears. I stayed inside, kept the fire low, shotgun ready. Around 3 a.m., I heard the crunch of snow outside. Soft, slow, like careful steps. I didn't go out. I just aimed at the door and waited. The steps stopped after a few minutes. Then silence. When the sun came up, I walked the perimeter and found a set of boot prints leading up to the porch. They stopped about 2 feet from the door. Then nothing, like the person had just vanished. The prints weren't deep, which meant they weren't fresh. I hadn't heard wrong. It had just snowed again before sunrise and softened everything. But those prints were real, too big for mine. Narrow heel. I didn't recognize the tread. I was done pretending it was all in my head. I drove down to the nearest village that day, about 35 minutes away, and bought a trail camera and a fresh lock for the cabin door. The shopkeeper asked if I was staying up by Kilmer Ridge, and when I nodded, he just gave a weird half smile. Didn't say anything. I didn't ask. I drove back fast, hung the camera facing the clearing out front, and kept the shotgun closer than ever. That night, I didn't hear anything. Nothing moved. The next 2 days were quiet, but the camera caught something. When I checked the SD card on the third morning, it had one clip from around 2:47 a.m. It showed a tall figure at the tree line just standing. Not walking, not moving, just standing, watching the cabin. No face visible. The resolution wasn't great, and the night vision washed out the detail, but it looked like a man in dark clothing. Just standing there. He stayed for over 6 minutes, then walked backwards into the trees. Backwards, like he didn't want to turn his back on the place. I packed my things. I didn't care about the peaceful retreat anymore. I threw everything into the Mondeo and left the cabin messy. I didn't want to spend another night there, but 30 minutes into the drive, the road was blocked. A fallen tree, thick and freshly downed, stretched from ditch to ditch. No way around it. I got out, swore loudly, and tried dragging a few smaller branches aside, but the main trunk was too heavy. No chainsaw, no winch. I had to turn around. That meant going back to the cabin. I kept driving, thinking I'd maybe sleep in the car closer to the village, but fog rolled in thick and fast. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. I made it about 2 miles before I nearly slid into a ditch. My hands were shaking, and I realized I hadn't eaten in almost 12 hours. I turned back, heart thudding like a drum. I didn't want to go back, but there wasn't much choice. When I reached the cabin, the front door was open. Not just unlocked, * open star. Why, I parked 20 feet back, lights off, and watched. No movement. I stepped out slowly, shotgun loaded, safety off. I crept up to the porch and stopped just before the threshold. Inside, everything was still. I cleared the cabin room by room. Nothing taken. Nothing moved. But on the bed was a small wooden carving. Rough, maybe 4 inches tall. A figure with a long neck, narrow legs, and arms stretched out. No face. It hadn't been there when I left. I tossed it into the fire without a second thought and bolted the door. I nailed it shut from the inside, dragged the bed frame against it, and kept the gun close all night. I didn't sleep. Not even a minute. First light, I tried the road again. This time, I found a sidetrack, a logging route that twisted further into the hills, but eventually rejoined the main road after about 10 miles. It was rough and I bottomed out once, but I made it through. I never went back for the camera. I never called Marcus to explain why I left his cabin in such a state. I stayed at a premier inn in Hexham that night and drove back to Derbyshire the next morning. For weeks, I couldn't sleep. Every sound at night felt like footsteps. I'd wake up gasping, shotgun on my lap. I stopped answering calls. I drank too much. It's been years now. I've moved twice since then. Sold the shotgun. Cut off most people I knew from that time. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I still see that figure. Not in dreams, just in my mind, behind closed eyes. Standing at the edge of trees. Watching. And sometimes, when I walk down a quiet street or take the bins out late at night, I think I see someone standing too still behind a hedge or on the other side of the road. I blink and they're gone. But the feeling stays.